This video is brought to you by the 1440. Be the smartest person in the room. Want all your news in a single email? Check out the 1440. They scour 100 sources so you don't have to. Culture, science, sports, politics, and business, all in a 5-minute read. 100% free. Also, there is a link below. More a bit later. There's an oft-repeated fact that the humble bumblebee defies all known laws of physics every time it flaps its tiny little bee wings and ascends to the sky. Well, obviously, this is false, since bumblebees fly all the time. If every time a bee took off it was tearing physics apart, we'd probably realize that that was the case when the planet was slowly consumed by millions of initially tiny bee-sized black holes. And certainly, if this was the case, every physicist dreaming of a Nobel Prize would be devoting all their time to breaking the code of bumblebee flight and, in the process, forever changing our understanding of the way that the universe works. That being said, if you worked out the maths behind the flight of the bumblebee, you'll find that it actually shouldn't be able to fly so long as you don't take into account the fact that it is a bee. So, what's going on here, and how did this myth get its start? The oft-repeated story goes that many years ago an engineer and an entomologist went to a bar and were having a few drinks, and at one point the entomologist turned to the engineer and said, "Why the long face?" Hold on a minute, that's actually the wrong story. He actually asked the engineer how to work out how a bee managed to fly despite its tiny little wings. Scientists apparently partied wicked hard back in those days. The engineer, keen to show off his skills, quickly jotted down a few calculations and came to the conclusion that, holy crap, a bee should not be able to fly. While it's always possible, albeit rather unlikely, that a drunken engineer did at some point make a back-of-an-envelope calculation that proved bees shouldn't be able to fly, there is no documented evidence supporting the aforementioned story. As far as documented evidence goes, we now turn to a French book published in 1934, Le Vol des Insectes, which makes passing reference to the fact that simple calculations yield a result that suggests nearly all winged insects, not just bumblebees, shouldn't be able to fly. Author Antoine Magnan states in Le Vol des Insectes that the calculations with regard to insects disobeying the laws of physics were made by his friend and assistant André Sandlarc. From here, what isn't known is how this supposed fact first ever eked into the public consciousness, as Le Vol des Insectes wasn't exactly an international bestseller. Again, another surprise there. It perhaps isn't too much of a stretch that this was read by a few professors who then repeated it to students, some of whom became professors, and the cycle then repeated itself. This sort of thing happens all the time. For example, the co-author of this piece had many a mathematics professor who would tell the anecdote that the reason there is no Nobel Prize for mathematics is because a mathematician stole Nobel's girl at one point, which isn't true in the slightest. We've got more on that in an upcoming video. If you're interested, be sure to subscribe, and while you're down there, you know what you gotta do, hit that like button. Okay, so going back to bee flight, for the calculations themselves, scientists, engineers, and entomologists have gone to great lengths to discredit them, as the original calculations failed to take into account a number of facts about the bee. Most pertinent of these, and please make sure you are sitting down before you hear this next part because it's going to come as quite a shock, bees do not fly like airplanes. I know, right? Just as important is that they don't have stiff, rigid wings when flapping. With that in mind, the original calculations, which were based mostly on the surface area of insect wings and their weight, comparing this to what sort of lift this could produce using models applicable to the way fixed-wing aircraft fly, aren't really applicable. The reality is that bees particularly fly in an incredibly complex way. In an overly simplistic nutshell, it's via flapping their wings more or less front to back while simultaneously rotating them appropriately to create that lift, and in fact also creating little low-pressure vortices in the air above their wings to further help with said lift. This front and back motion also allows them to create a lift both on the forward and back strokes. To find this out, scientists have conducted a variety of experiments using bees, the most awesome one being Chinese scientist Li Zheng and his team, who devised a system comprised of lasers and tiny mirrors that were glued to bees' backs, and he did this in 2001. The experiment was deemed superior to previous tests as it didn't need to use tethered bees, so in this case the bees would fly more naturally, and we can only assume it was also more accurate because the experiment involved lasers, which are always a necessity for an experiment to be considered fully scientific. In fact, we're certain that a laboratory full of Asian scientists firing tiny laser beams at bees covered in shiny body armor is going to be the next big Sci-Fi Channel hit, so remember that you heard it here first. But in any event, the way bees and other comparable creatures fly is so efficient that research into the subject has been backed by various militaries in an attempt to mimic this method of flight with our own tiny insect-like robots. And we believe this is yet another recipe for an amazing sci-fi hit. And with that, if you'll excuse me, I've got a pilot to write. Not really. Instead, I'm going to tell you some bonus facts, but you already know that because there's a whole bunch of minutes left on this video, and I gotta get to that 10-minute mark, people. Just kidding, but this video probably will get there. Just before we get into those, though, I want to tell you about 1440. If you want to be the smartest person in the room, I mean, you're already doing quite well because you're watching Today I Found Out, but the 1440 Daily Digest email news wrap-up would also be a great addition to your day. But look, if you're anything like me, you have way too many emails to read on a regular basis, and you don't want another email in your inbox. But what's great about 1440 is that it provides an amazing news wrap-up. You get all of your news and updates in a single email. Check out the 1440 Daily Digest. It scours over 100 sources ranging from culture and science to sports and politics to create one digest email that you can read in 5 minutes or less. No more wasting time browsing news sites, just 5 minutes and you're done. It's also 100% free, so there's that. It has everything you need to be aware of in the day, and most importantly, it simplifies your life. Sign up for 1440, support Today I Found Out by doing that, by the way, so you can support us for free. That's a plus, and there is a link in the description below. And let's crack on with those bonus facts, shall we? Moving on from bees to yet another insect that has a particularly pervasive myth associated with it, and that's cockroaches. You've probably heard that the only living thing that would survive a nuclear war would be cockroaches. It has even been suggested that cockroaches can survive the amount of radiation at ground zero of a large nuclear explosion, though of course not the explosion itself. The truth is, however, that while cockroaches can withstand ionizing radiation bursts about 10 times as high as humans, they actually are relative lightweights in that arena. In fact, it only takes a burst of about 1,000 rads to significantly interfere with a cockroach's ability to reproduce, which would obviously be the eventual end of the cockroach in the long run. For reference, this is about the level of radiation at around 15 miles from Hiroshima directly after the bomb detonated. Further, at burst levels of around 6,400 rads, about 94% of immature cockroaches will die, and at burst levels around 10,000 rads, most adult cockroaches will not survive either. While this is very impressive by human standards, humans only being able to survive about 4 to 1,000 rads before death, it's decidedly unimpressive by insect standards. Most insects can survive much higher rates than the cockroach, according to the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, who, when they aren't spending their time trying to spit out their name, apparently enjoy zapping various living things with ionizing radiation. So who are the actual living creatures that would inherit the Earth after a worldwide nuclear war? Well, it has been shown that fruit flies take around a burst of 64,000 rads to kill. More impressive than that is the flower beetle, which can withstand up to around 100,000 rads before dying. Even better is a type of wasp, the bracken, that can survive bursts as high as 180,000 rads. But these all get beat by the Deinococcus radiodurans microbe. This bacteria can survive radiation levels as high as 1.5 million rads at room temperature and nearly 3 million rads when frozen, such as during a hypothetical nuclear winter. So it isn't entirely clear where the myth that cockroaches were impervious to ionizing radiation got started, but it seems to have been largely popularized by anti-nuclear activists in the 1960s who often used the cockroach in their slogans and campaigns. For instance, in a New York Times advertisement sponsored by the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, "A nuclear war, if it comes, will not be won by the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese. The winner of World War III will be the cockroach." One thing also important to explicitly point out here, though, is the previously stated numbers don't quite tell the whole story in a nuclear fallout type scenario. You see, insects are so good at surviving exposure to ionizing radiation primarily because their cells don't divide that much between molting cycles, and cells are most susceptible to damage by ionizing radiation when they are dividing. Given that a typical cockroach only molts about once per week and its cells only divide around a 48-hour period during that week, about 3/4 of the cockroaches exposed would not be particularly susceptible to damage by ionizing radiation, at least relative to those whose cells were currently dividing. As you might have inferred inferred from this means that if the radiation experienced by these cockroaches was consistent over a long period of time, they are going to have significantly more problems than in the numbers we previously suggested. All of those numbers from before were just where it was a burst of radiation for a short amount of time. On the other hand, humans and other mammals are very susceptible to this type of radiation, as we experience cellular division all the time. This is also one of the reasons radiation is effective at low doses at killing cancer cells relative to what is required to damage healthy cells. Cancer cells divide much quicker than other cells in the human body, thus you can often kill the cancer cells faster than the healthy cells and hopefully find a happy medium where all the cancer cells die, but enough of the healthy cells remain so the person can continue living just as they were before. In any event, while cockroaches may not be well equipped to survive nuclear fallout, relative to various microbes and most of their insect brethren, these little critters are extremely hardy, with fossil records of cockroaches dating all the way back to 300 million BC, which predates dinosaurs by about 70 million years. Cockroaches have also been shown to survive with their heads chopped off for nearly a month. Further, they can survive as much as 45 minutes without oxygen and can survive on very low quality of food, such as the glue on a postage stamp or cellulose, and very little of this to boot. They can even survive for quite some time by simply eating each other if needs be. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, please do check out the 1440. It's for free as well. It's a great way to support the show. There is a link below. And thank you for watching.